Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Senator. Senator Niall Donnghaile, 8 minutes.
Minister, thank you for your attendance today, and we will be supporting this legislation. I'm sure, like me, you didn't necessarily expect the debate thus far to take on such a touchy or indeed defensive tone, but perhaps that's indicative of where we're coming from, but also reflective of earlier politics and why this kind of legislation is important, as has been rightly acknowledged by everyone despite the back and forwarding. But this bill brings current laws on corruption up to date, Minister, and consolidates them. It also implements a number of international and EU obligations upon the state, as you have outlined. The bill aims to clarify and strengthen corruption offences in this jurisdiction and those from outside it, but indeed who are acting within it. It provides greater clarity on trading and influence offences, which is overdue. While in our public life or in business or commerce, corruption has been part of the history of this state. We have had tribunals of inquiry investigating various issues, including planning corruption, zoning controversies, bribery, corporate fraud, significant government contracts awarded in a process subsequently found to be biased and defective, unexplained payments, and a banking crisis in which nobody paid the price for their actions other than the ordinary citizen. This state's attitude towards corporate fraud and corruption, however, has been casual and slack up to now. It appears the government has been most passive. It appears that some governments have indeed been most passive in this area. However, I do recognise that the bill recognises little has been done in this area since the government came into office, and I hope it will address such cultural issues, particularly in institutions and sectors where questionable practices almost appear to be the norm. This culture of corruption goes right to the top of many institutions, be they private or public, throughout the state. And to state otherwise would be blind to the past. The body responsible for eradicating corruption is the Office of the Director of Corporate Enforcement, ODCE. Last November it was announced that this office was being overhauled, and this is indeed welcome news given the history we all know about. The office brought no prosecutions and achieved no convictions over the past 2 years. Only 43 prosecutions have been brought by the ODCE in the past decade, a shockingly low amount over this time, especially given the context of what happened since 2007. In addition, the annual reports of the ODCE show that almost €6 million in its allocated funding has been returned to the state over the past 3 years, including €2.7 million in 2016. In the same year, no prosecutions or convictions were achieved by the agency. So there is clearly a requirement for an overhaul of the agency, as well as more investment therein. One matter that most frustrated people over the course of the session was that while people suffered, some grievously, it appeared no one was brought to justice for the banking crisis. We didn't see any level of court cases any kind of the level of court cases that were brought in the US or other jurisdictions where corrupt and immoral practices took place. This may have been down to deficiencies in legislation, and that's why this bill is welcome. I believe it also happened because of the under-resourcing and lack of support for the ODC. So it needs extra powers and it needs extra resources. The corporate liability of the bill needs to be strengthened. In particular, the defence of reasonable action needs to be clearly explained. And members know from the Paradise Papers and the scandal involving AIB and indeed other banks that financial institutions will use any chink in the legislative armour to squeeze more money out of the taxpayer and their customers. Corruption comes in many different forms and in many different ways. And there has, of course, as we all know, been institutionalised white-collar crime and corruption in the state that was facilitated by past legislation. We saw this spectacularly in the Apple tax debacle. Much needed income for public services lost by the government's inaction and failure to tax this company. And the government's track record in dealing with challenging and holding people to account for white-collar crime is thus far appalling. The key to eradicating corruption is not just legislation and robust legislation. It's also about pursuing those who are corrupt and bringing them before the courts. There can be no tolerance of or indeed hiding place for people involved in white-collar crime. They have to face the full rigour of the law, and that's why I welcome the tabling of this bill today, Minister, and look forward to working in partnership with you and indeed colleagues in this House to ensure that we bury that past culture of negligence and that we can utilise and harness the proposed legislation here to its fullest, to work cooperatively and together to ensure that the kind of culture and indeed crimes we saw committed in the past aren't allowed to be repeated in the future.
Thank you very much, Senator. Senator David Norris.